everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of the Deadman Bandits. I'm Warren Phillips.
I'm Mike Farah.
And first and foremost, thank you to our sponsor, Tomorrow's Publishing. So many wonderful publications coming out now. Go to TWOMORROWS.com. See all they have. Order a lot of books. Now, let's talk about who we have on the show today. It is one of my all-time favorite authors. We're talking about Mr. Mike Baron, the man behind Badger, Nexus, Punisher, The Flash. So many wonderful, wonderful books. And he's putting out his own publications now, like Florida Man, and so many other great books. And I'm so jealous I missed this one. But Mike, tell us a little bit more about your interview with Mike Baron.
Yeah, this was literally Mike and Mike on the mic. There was a lot of Mike going on. But yeah, Mike Baron is just a phenomenal writer. And Oren gave his sort of bona fides there, and we get into all of that. And in fact, some of his novel writing. And he has a new comic that's out there, kind of a supernatural Western called Bronze Star, which you definitely want to check out. We'll put the website in the show notes. But you know, we go kind of soup to nuts with Mike, and he imparts some really great writing knowledge approaches. So if you're an aspiring writer, definitely listen to this one. This one is Mike Baron. How are you?
Doing good.
Great. Welcome to the show. We're so happy you're on. We're going to start you off with the question that we ask everybody else. We're almost legally obligated at this point to ask, which is, how did you first discover comic books?
I picked up an Uncle Scrooge comic from a spinner rack in Mitchell, South Dakota when I was a kid. And I took it home and read it. And I thought, holy shit, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I started seeking out every Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge comic that I could find. And the only ones I could find, of course, were those available on the newsstand. But I was lucky enough to be alive then when they were releasing a lot. And it took me a couple years to track down the man behind these stories. His name was Carl Barks. He's one of the greatest comic creators of all time. And anybody who wants to do comics, and they say, well, who should I look at? I would say, look at Carl Barks, because not only do his stories have depth, not only they for all ages. When I say all ages, yeah, they appeal to kids, but they also appeal to adults. There's not a wasted word or a wasted frame in any of them. He just had a touch. I would say he's one of the greatest comic book creators who ever lived, certainly in the top 5.
You'd be actually surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, considering you brought up Scrooge, that the Donald Duck and the Duck series of Disney books are often the first books that we hear about when we ask that question. So I find it very interesting, but we'll definitely look up Carl Barks, was it, right?
Yeah, his name was Carl Barks, and I finally tracked him down. I was like 10 years old. And I said, gee, Mr. Barks, would you draw me a picture of Scrooge? And I didn't think it would go anywhere. And then to my astonishment, a couple weeks later, this arrived in the mail. I just sent it to you on Facebook in the Dollar Bin Bandits message thing. And I still have that on my wall.
Amazing. Now, from that first of all, we always like to ask the follow-up question. Do you happen to still have those original books that you picked up?
No, I don't, but I have massive reprints, big hardbound volume sets that were put out by various publishers over the years that cover most of his vital work. So they are available if you know where to look for them.
Oh, good. We'll let the viewers know about that. So did you, based on, your first experience, or did it accumulate over time, know that this is something you wanted to get into as your career?
I knew I wanted to be a writer, and I went about it at a very roundabout way. I mentioned working for Boston Phoenix. Well, there was a weekly newspaper in town when I was going to college at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And I knew the editor. I went over there one day, and there were hundreds of brand new albums leaning against the wall. And I said, Mark, where'd you get these records? And he said, the record company sent them to us. You want some? Take them. Just write something about them. and I wanted the records, so I took them and I wrote something about them, and that's how I started writing about music. And in fact, that's one of the ways I broke into journalism, and I'm still writing about music today.
So how did you, starting as a music journalist and obviously continuing to be a music journalist, but how did you move or add to your repertoire comic books to that? Because it doesn't seem necessarily like a natural transition, I guess.
Well, I was always a comic fan. I loved the form, and I wanted to do them. And I actually drew for years, trying to turn myself into an artist, and I never did. But what I was able to do was to draw well enough that anybody could see at a glance what I had in mind. And so for 20 years, I wrote comics by drawing each page out by hand. And artists and editors loved it because they could see at a glance what I was doing. And it also taught me so many valuable lessons. I would encourage anybody who wants to do comics to do this. And one of the reasons is it teaches you how much weight a page can bear. When you're just writing prose, when you're just doing a script, some people get carried away. They write too many words. They don't write enough words. But when you're drawing the page out yourself by hand, you can see how the two parts work together. It also taught me to always think about what happens next, which is the essential question in all fiction. The reader has to care before he turns the page. Well, how do you make the reader care? There are an infinite number of ways. I'm just going to offer 3. You create a fascinating character that people can't get enough of, Sherlock Holmes. You create a fascinating situation that is inherently appealing, Jurassic Park. Or you create a seductive narrative voice. Now, this mostly applies to straight prose, less so to comics, because comics are a collaborative enterprise. But many comic book writers have a unique voice. Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore come to mind, and Chuck Dixon. But they're working in concert with the artist as well. When I think of straight prose and I think of a unique voice, I think of Raymond Chandler, who created Philip Marlowe and almost single-handedly created the tough private eye genre, and also Dashiell Hammett, his contemporary, who did the same thing.
I find that very interesting, the process by which you sort of lay out comics. I think that is probably, as you said, just so valuable to writers, especially writers that may not come from comics and may not, understand the pacing and, like you said, sort of how much a page can hold. So that's very interesting. So wondering how then you kind of broke into the business, using these methods, and specifically, I know one of your first, big books was Nexus with Steve Rude. So how did you apply these, original processes and approaches to getting into, your own book, basically?
Well, I moved back to Madison in '77, and I was working at an insurance company a couple years later. And I got a phone call from an editor who said, there's a guy down here trying to sell us his art, and I think you would be interested in it. And he gave me the dude's phone number. He was living at the YMCA at the time. And I called him, and we met on the steps of the student union. He opened up his portfolio, and I was knocked out. Right away, I gave up my dream of being a professional artist. And I said, well, dude, what do you want to do? He says, well, I want to create comics, but I can't write. What do you want to do? And we were in the right place at the right time. Capital City Distribution, the second largest distributor of comics in the world at the time, decided to launch their own titles. So I went home and I brainstormed Nexus. And I did it this way. I thought, what if every time the protagonist appeared, somebody died? That would be compelling. And that's not a great revelation. That's why we are basking in cop shows and lawyer shows and medical shows for half a century, because those professions deal with life and death, and that's the stuff of drama. But in my case, he was a science fiction character. He was a reluctant executioner of mass murderers. And there's this whole backstory of how he got this way. And it was encapsulated in our Origin issue, which Dark Horse published. This was years after the original Origin. I completely rewrote it, and dude completely redrew it. And that issue got us both a couple of Eisners. It turns out that Horatio Hellpop, who is Nexus, was the chosen by an insane alien to be the conscience of his race. Every night he dreams of mass murderers and their crimes, and when he wakes, exhausted, he knows he has to track them down and execute them, or the dreams will continue until they kill him. And that was the kernel of the story. I drew the first 12 pages out by hand. I gave them to the dude. He penciled, inked, and lettered them, and we showed them to the boys, and they said, yeah, now give us 20 more pages, and we were off and running.
So Capital Comics was already sort of an entity, and you knew that if you can come up with something yourself or with Steve, that is something that you could pitch to Capital. So it wasn't as if you guys had gotten together necessarily and put everything together and then started looking around. You knew that there was this avenue that was
we were lucky,
ready for you.
Yes, we were in the right place at the right time. We did a story prior to that about a guy trying to sell insurance, trying to sell encyclopedias door to door after a huge disaster had devastated civilization, and it appeared in Pacific Presents, but that's not what they were looking for. They wanted a superhero, and that's what we gave them.
And so you, I guess, parlayed that into another character eventually, although you continued to do Nexus, which is right behind you in your panorama here of Badger.
Oh, no.
Either way. Now I'm pointing the wrong way. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how that came about. Was that character in your back pocket, or was that just like, oh, Nexus kind of hit and now it's time for another?
No, this story is, I had seen Jeff Butler's art on a poster down on campus. And so I got a hold of him and said, Jeff, do you want to do comics? He said, yeah. He said, well, what do you want to draw? I always ask this. And he said, I want to draw Druid wizards. And I said, okay. So I wrote this 10-page story about a Welsh wizard who was so cantankerous, the other wizards took up a collection and hired some Vikings to put him in a coma, sail west, and drop him off the edge of the earth. Of course, as we know, they didn't come to the edge of the earth. But anyhow, Jeff penciled and inked it and lettered. It was beautiful. I took it in to show the boys, and they looked at it, and Mill said, nah, nobody wants to read about wizards. We want a costume crime fighter. And my first reaction was, why would anybody put on a costume and fight crime? They'd have to be insane. And I was reading The Minds of Billy Milligan at the time, one of the first serious studies of multiple personality disorder. And then it all hit me at once. The Badger, who was a multiple personality, only one of whom was a costume crime fighter. And there were 6 other personalities. So I said, Jeff, I got a great idea. And I told him, I says, well, I don't want to waste these pages. I said, fine. We'll start with Ham, and then I'll bring Badger in at the end of the 10 pages, and it'll turn out that he and Ham are sitting in adjacent padded cells at a mental institution. And that's how Ham met Badger.
That's amazing.
I know.
And did you feel like, even though you were sort of shoehorning that together for the first issue, that there was plenty of, open sky to go with the
it turns out that it was unlimited open sky, and I'm still doing Badger today.
Right.
And Jeff is still doing commissions, although he stopped doing continuity many years ago. I love the Badger, and he's got many, many followers. And most of the stories are very funny. They released my id, and the Badger was kind of the vehicle for my id. And there are so many stories where I would hit upon what people were thinking but never dared say, and it was in issue after issue.
Well, it really is a fantastic book, as is Nexus, and I'm glad that those both continue to recur and come back, and the story just continues to unfold. What was interesting is that, after these, getting into basically your own creator-owned comics back in the day, different than sort of the Kickstarter world of today, but you did eventually move into the larger publishers, Marvel and DC. Was that always the plan, or was it kind of a happy accident after you got into the industry?
Well, I looked at Marvel and DC and I always thought, boy, I'd love to write some of those comics. But I didn't make any overtures. What happened was Carl Barks was a big fan of the Badger. No, excuse me. Carl Potts.
I was
Carl
gonna
Potts.
ask.
And he called me up one day and said, Mike, how'd you like to write The Punisher? And I said, I'd love to write The Punisher. And that's how I came to write The Punisher. I wrote it for 5 years, starting with issue number 1. And my editor at First Comics moved to DC, Mike Gold. And he called me up and said, Mike, how would you like to write Flash? I said, well, I would love to write Flash. And that's how I moved into the majors.
It's interesting that you moved in on these two characters because for the most part, they couldn't be more different, right? What appealed to you about the Punisher, and then also appealed to you about the Flash? Because you're coming from, sci-fi background, somewhat superhero, I guess, with Badger, but then to, this big time gritty vigilante on one hand, and this much lighter, light on his feet, as well as lighter in tone superhero. Was there did you feel like you were sort of a man with two brains writing these two?
No, the Punisher appealed to me immediately because he's the classic American vigilante. And the vigilante looms large in the American experience. Wyatt Earp was a vigilante. So many others were vigilantes too. Wild Bill Hickok was a vigilante for a time. And the reason we love our vigilantes is when they did well. And when America was conquering the frontier and moving west, there was no law there. The only law was a law that you can enforce with the point of a gun. And thus vigilantes were necessary. And then a settlement would grow up, and it would, and time would come around. They said, well, we need a government now. We need a mayor. And finally they said, well, we need a sheriff. We need a police force. So civilization followed the vigilante. And Americans love their vigilantes. Look at Dirty Harry and Death Wish, Charles Bronson's Death Wish. The vigilantes that pour out of the Hollywood every year. I've seen at least a dozen in the past year. I'm thinking of The Mother, which stars Jennifer Lopez.
Okay.
And you may not know this, but she made a vigilante movie this year called The Mother, and it's very good. And she's just one. And there's that other one called Nobody, which stars a guy from Better Call Saul. Did you see that? That's another vigilante character. And it turns out that all these vigilante characters are living quiet lives, but when they're pushed, it all turns out they're all CIA assassins, CIA trained.
So there's a continuum of this tradition of sort of vigilante characters in Justice, and you saw Punisher as being the one for the era in which you were writing.
Yeah, well, I like Punisher because he's street level. He's not super powered. It could happen. It's possible. Batman is a vigilante too, but Batman gets a little fantastic with his bizarre heroes and inventions and trips. Whereas the Punisher, at least for the first, I approached the Punisher as a straight crime comic with no science fiction or robots or time travel or any of that. And that's how I wrote him for 3 years. Then I got a new editor who was more of a gimmick guy. And so he started to interact more with the Marvel universe. But I tried to keep him street level the whole time. I'm at a place in my life where I can't enjoy a film unless I believe it could actually happen in real life. And the same goes for comics too. And that doesn't mean that I'm cutting myself off from sci-fi or fantasy, because I love Alien and Aliens. Both those movies qualify. They're absolutely credible because they believe in themselves, and, and they worked out every detail so that you believe them too.
I love that kind of sci-fi. I mean, I'm also a sucker for the fantastical as well, but the more grounded sci-fi that sort of establishes rules and lives by them is really fantastic. I think that up until this current season, which got a little more fantastical, if you've ever seen the show Black Mirror,
I've been meaning to watch it. I
yeah,
probably will.
it's an anthology show, and there's some wonderful premises and sort of that kind of sci-fi, if you will. So let's go to the other side of the coin, which is the Flash. Again, so you have Vigilante, Punisher, understand where that's coming from, what the appeal there. What about the Flash? What did you hope to bring to that character, and what appealed to you about that character?
Well, I hope to bring realism, and I think that's what I did. I mean, given the fantastical character of a person who can run faster than the speed of sound, I asked myself, well, how can he do this? And then of course, he was born with a lightning bolt, as so many superheroes are. But realistically speaking, he would burn up 1,000,000 calories running around like that. So I thought about it and said, well, this is a guy who has to eat 5 big meals a day just to maintain his energy. And that was the first innovation that made him more credible to the audience, because for the first time they looked at the Flash and they said, yeah, that makes sense. That fits the character. That's what he'd have to do. I also made him a little bit of a self-absorbed young punk, which I thought was appropriate to the character. As he was replacing Barry Allen, he wasn't the original Flash, and the readers responded. And the only reason I stopped writing that is that I just ran out of ideas. That would not happen today, and I'm kind of sorry I let it go, but not really, because I've been busier than I ever have been in my life recently with projects that mean even more to me, because they're projects for the most part that I created.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to get to that a little later, and I'd love to hear more about what you're, sinking your teeth into and passionate about with your own creations. I just wanted a couple more questions, I think, within this realm, because it's interesting the way your answers are unfolding. One is, so you have Flash, which is, certainly fantastical, but yet you're bringing a little bit of realism to that. And you can see where there's a little bit of a sci-fi conceit there. But then you also did a fairly big run on Action Comics, right? With the big man himself, Superman. What was that? Was that a similar approach?
In Action Comics, I wrote Deadman.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right, because that was an explosive project. I was working with Kelley Jones, and that was the book on which Kelley Jones became Kelley Jones. Because I worked with a number of artists, I think Dan Jurgens included, doing short stories for Action Comics. And I forgot whose idea it was to do a graphic novel based on Deadman. I think it was mine. I hope it was mine. And my insight was that Deadman was not a superhero. He was a horror character, and that's how I wrote him. And that's where Kelley just exploded and became Kelley Jones. When he do that first graphic novel, I mean, you can see it. That graphic novel is available as a giant black and white book.
Yeah,
graffiti. And
he is certainly fantastic, and
yeah.
that book, for some reason I remember it as Deadman, so I didn't associate it with Action Comics, like his own title. But yeah, and he put certainly his own stamp on it. I mean, the Deadman himself become much more skeletal,
Yes,
looking, and really
it
taking
was
the
called
first part of
Love
his
After
name.
Death.
Yeah. So you've mentioned a number of, your long runs, and I've brought them up as well. And you also told me a little bit about why you left Flash, but I'm curious to know, how do you know when to leave a book, especially when you're on these long, years-long runs? It may not be your choice, I guess, but if it is your choice, how do you know when the time has come to move on?
Well, it wasn't my choice, and there are a number of titles I wish I could claw back that because not everything was a home run. And there were changing editors. They wanted to bring in their own people. That always happens. And finally, I just fell out of the industry, and there was 10 years there where I couldn't get any writing work at all. And I took any job I could get. I was a janitor for a while. And then I moved from Madison, Wisconsin to Colorado. And I had some tragedy in my life. And finally, I decided, well, it's time to try writing again. And, I've been trying to write a novel for 30 years. I thought that's what I wanted to be, was a novelist. And what I wrote was awful stuff. And I realize that now. But when I finally tried again, I was writing Banshees, my big horror novel about a satanic rock band that returns from the dead. And as I was writing that, I thought, holy shit, I understand story. And when you understand story, you don't make any wrong turns. And I realized that I had summited the impossible mountain of learning how to master my craft. And since then, I've probably got 17 or 18 novels in print by now. The most one, I didn't mention John D. MacDonald, and that's the reason I'm writing today. Even before Uncle Scrooge, there was John D. MacDonald, one of America's greatest pulp writers, and he created a character called Travis McGee, who is very much in the Philip Marlowe mode, a tarnished knight who down these mean streets must go. And I'm not the only one. He inspired many writers, but he inspired me to create a character called Biker. And I just turned in the 10th Biker novel. They're all published by Wolfpack. They're all available on Amazon. Biker is Josh Pratt, a reformed motorcycle hoodlum who went to prison, and he found God in prison. And he comes out determined to turn his life around. The stories are grim. They are filled with action, with ace characterization. I'm very happy with them. The readers are ecstatic too. And if you like hard-boiled crime, I would say give Biker a try. Then the other two novels I favor. The type is horror. I mentioned Banshees. I also wrote a novel called Scorpio about a ghost who only appears under a blazing sun, and Domain, which is the ultimate haunted house story. And the third type of novel I write is humor, which is Florida Man, and they're by far my most popular novels. There are 3 Florida Man novels in print right now, and I'm working on the 4th. And because they lend itself to a graphic treatment, we started the Florida Man graphic novel was the first graphic novel we crowdfunded. And that's where I met Chris Brawley. Before that, we did crowdfund Cue Ball, which I created with Barry McLean. And my wife, Ann, ran that campaign, and it was very successful. But we only coughed up the 1 issue. And now we're about to launch Florida Man graphic novel number 2. And Florida Man is exactly what you think it is. Its only purpose is to make you laugh. And from the response I get, I think I hit the bullseye. People keep writing me and say, I was listening to it on audio tape in my car, and I was laughing so hard I had to pull over to the side of the road. And my wife kicked me out of bed because I was reading it and laughing so hard she couldn't get to sleep. I got a lot of reviews like that. I'm very proud of it. And it's probably, it's great fun for me to write, and I hope it's great fun for the reader to read. But the horror novels and the crime novels are fun for me to write too. It's just a different mindset.
We're definitely passionate about people putting out their own work, which, I want to hear more about. So I know you have an Indiegogo campaign also, besides the second Florida Man adaptation. Could you
Oh,
tell
right
us?
now, yeah, this
Yeah,
Bronze
could you tell us
Star.
about that?
Bronze Star is a supernatural Western. It came about because I asked Pat Broderick, whom I've always admired, I said, Pat, what do you want to draw? And he said, I want to draw a supernatural Western. So I created Bronze Star for him. And it's the greatest work of his career. And people who are familiar with him will be astonished to learn that, because when you get to be his age, a lot of artists just start coasting. But Pat just keeps getting better and better. I don't know if there's any way you can show that black and white page I sent you on the screen, but if you can, you should, because it gives an indication of what he puts into each page. The detail is just astonishing. And the black and white pages are so brilliant that we're offering an oversized Bronze Star is a supernatural Western. It's called Bronze Star because the sheriff can't wear silver.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Hint,
to give
hint.
you a clue as to what it's about, but that's not what it's all about. That's just a little bit of the story. And as I said, it's the greatest work of Pat Broderick's career. It's just mind-boggling. If you're looking for it, you can find it at bronzestarcomic.com.
Okay.
And likewise, if you're looking for Private American, you can find that at theprivateamerican.com. And you can find Thin Blue Line at thinbluelinecomics.com.
Great. All right, we'll put all those links in the show notes, and we'll try to work in the Pat Broderick art because it is truly fantastic. I wanted to see if you have a little extra time to continue to plumb the depths of your career and go to a few other
Sure.
places.
Sure.
Great. So a couple other places I wanted to go. One was back to the early/mid 90s and Valiant. Which I see, is represented in your wallpaper there in Turok. So what was it like being at that company at that time? Because that was basically when, Marvel and DC were starting to lose a little bit of their grip. Of course, they, I think, probably pulled it all back. But to Image and Valiant, and, there were these new characters out there that were really getting a lot of attention. Was that what was it like for you to be in that environment?
Oh, it was great. The first title they gave me was Armstrong and Archer, which is a Barry Smith creation. And I have to tell you that I did not know what to do with that book. I did the best I could. But the other titles they gave me, man, I snapped them up and I knew just what to do. And they included Turok, Son of Stone, and Shadow Man, and of course that type of black magic. That's the kind of stuff I love to write about. And I worked with good friends on that, Vail Myerick, and on Turok, we brought in great artist named Spider. He's a Canadian, and he did a number of Badgers as well. And his real name was Neil Evans. And I call him up from time to time. I say, Neil, I'd love to work with you on something. He says, Mike, I can't draw anymore. I tried. I sat down at my drawing board, and nothing would come. And that shocked me because his work is some of the most original and exciting I've ever seen. He did a book called Untamed for Epic. And if you can ever dig a copy up, you should take a look at it, because his work will blow your mind. And it blows my mind that he doesn't draw anymore. But that happens. I've known that happen with a lot of artists. Very few artists stick with it for the long run and keep getting better and better.
We'll definitely look that up.
Rags Morales was another artist I worked with on Turok, and Rags is just a great artist. I'd love to work with him again.
Yeah, he's fantastic. We had him on the show, and yeah, would love to see more work from him there or other places. I'm wondering, at Valiant, maybe compared to the big two that you had experiences at before, did you have more opportunity to put your own stamp on characters or to develop them because there maybe was not as much backstory?
Well, I don't try to put my own stamp on these characters. I try to do the most absorbing story I can, with what they give me. I don't want to take over a character and suddenly switch directions in the middle of the stream. I want to respect the source material. But these characters were all pretty young, except for Turok, who goes back, of course, to the Gold Key days. And Turok was wide open too, because he never got the in-depth treatment that, let's say, the X-Men did under Chris Claremont. I mean, Turok was whatever you wanted him to be, as long as he was a Native American fighting dinosaurs. And that's the premise, you know, and once you accept that premise, you can do whatever you want with him, as long as it's consistent and credible within the rules of its own world, which is what I try to do.
Right. You're off to the races once you have the premise and it's accepted, and suspension of disbelief. As long as everybody sort of jumps in the same time, I think you're good to go.
Yeah, in fact, I'd like to mention my 3 rules of writing, and these are rules I've formulated for myself, and they're not for everybody, but perhaps people can use them. And number 1 is, it's my job to entertain, and I never lose sight of that fact. Everything I put into the book is designed to increase the reader's interest, so that he wants to know what happens next, which is the most important question in fiction. Number 2 is show, don't tell. And that means any information you can impart to the reader visually without words that advances the story, you should. I always think of the beginning of Better Call Saul, which often began with a 5-minute wordless sequence where the camera is just following, say, Mike Ehrmantraut as he sneaks into a factory and opens a locker and steals somebody's ID. And then he comes back a few minutes later to get admitted to the factory as a legitimate employee. And you say, oh, I see. And the 3rd rule is to be original. And we're all unique human beings, and we necessarily bring our worldview to whatever it is that we write. And by being unique in an interesting way, that makes the story more compelling. And I go back to John D. MacDonald again, his Travis McGee novels. I remember him writing in the 60s and 70s when Travis had to take an airplane somewhere. He says, they treat us like children. I don't know why people put up with this. And this was back in the 70s, you know, and that comes from John D. MacDonald's personal experience. And I thought that was kind of funny. And I wonder what he would think of air travel if he were alive today.
I love those rules. And in addition to the ones you gave earlier for, you know, sort of breaking in and trying to understand how to write for comics, they're great, you know, rules and thoughts to live by, and to write by. I wanted to also ask about, you had referenced Epic, and you had your own Epic book with Bill Reinhold called Spike. How did that come about, and what was it like working within Epic? Was there anything different about it than main Marvel? What was the experience?
Well, it was a wonderful opportunity because we got to create our own characters. And this was Carl Pott's idea as well. So Carl was just a dynamo. And I love working with Bill Reinhold. I'd love to work with him again. But Bill has been spending the last 10 years illustrating this huge World War II graphic novel that Carl wrote. And he's still working on it, as far as I know. Must be up to about page 516 now, but I don't know. I should bug him and get a cover out of him. I think I will. And the other one I did was, I did it with Mark Nelson, Feud. And it was a funny animal universe. And if you're familiar with Mark Nelson's work, it's sui generis. He looks like nobody else. He's just one of the most unique artists I've ever worked with. And he brought it to life, and we had a lot of fun with that too. People still ask about that. You know, and if somebody were interested in doing new adventures, I would do it. I'd be happy to do it. But I'm much happier with the work that I have produced in the past 10 to 15 years, because, as I said, I had that revelation where I understood story. And once you understand story, you don't make a wrong turn. A lot of writers, and I see them all the time. They're friends of mine. They ask me questions. They say, "Oh, is it any good? I don't know. I'm afraid to show it to anybody. Will you please read this and tell me if it's any good?" But once you understand story, you don't have those problems. You know it's good.
Yeah, you have the
That doesn't mean
confidence.
you're going to make money out of it.
But at least you have the confidence.
Yeah, yeah. Because I can name one brilliant writer after another that I think is just great that never could make a real living at it. There are just so many out there. And there are 1 million novels a year published in the United States. That's not an exaggeration. A
Yeah.
lot of them are self-published.
Yeah. No, I mean, like everything, you can't overestimate the role that luck plays, I think, sometimes, because
That's
there
true.
are a lot of talented individuals out there. And what makes one have this humongously successful career when you can make an argument that this person toiling away in obscurity is just as good in whatever discipline that is?
You could.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, I did want to, because we did talk a little bit about adaptation, and I wanted to ask you about Star Wars, because you did a decent amount of Star Wars at Dark Horse, and particularly adapting
Heir to the Empire.
Heir to the Empire, Timothy Zahn's, which is, I don't know how much is going into these new series with Thrawn and everything, but what did you were you a big fan of Star Wars, first of all, and then and what did you enjoy about the process of adaptation? Do you like that, taking something from one place and making it into a comic?
I do. I don't like it as much as creating my own stuff, but an adaptation presents its own challenges. One of the things I pride myself is whenever I adapt a novel, I don't use any of my own language. I don't change anything. I pride myself on using the author's own language, and there's not a spoken word in Heir to the Empire that I wrote. It's everything Timothy Zahn wrote. And I would adapt it. And they say, we need 6 issues of a comic from this novel, Heir to the Empire. So I divided it up by 6 according to the pages, with making an allowance for natural breaks and beginnings, which means you have to end each issue where a chapter ends and start the next issue where the next chapter begins. And then I drew them all out by hand, and I added all the dialogue and descriptions, which I just took from the novel. So it was none of my own language. I was just transforming it into a visual experience on paper.
Makes sense. And is it something, even though you are doing, your own stuff right now and enjoying that, that you'd ever like to do again?
Well, in fact, I am. I'm
with
adapting.
Florida Man, right?
No. Those are my own works. I'm adapting John Ringo's science fiction novels about a zombie apocalypse into a graphic novel. Chuck Dixon did the first. It was called Red Tide or Black Tide Rising, and I have written the second. And it's being illustrated by a great Brazilian artist named Elias Martins. And it will be published next year, and it will be available in bookstores. But it was mind-boggling complex, because I wasn't just adapting one novel. I was adapting 2 novels into one while overlooking the material that Chuck adapted from the first novel into his own version. But we got it. We got it done. We got it down. And now it's being illustrated.
And we are back. Mike Farah, a phenomenal job with Mike Baron. I'm a huge Badger fan, and the one things I love so much about the book is, Badger will be right in the middle of a huge fight scene, and suddenly he just collapses and a different personality comes out. And it's those little twists and that kind of storytelling that I think makes Mike Baron so special and really one of the best in the business today.
Yeah. One thing that stuck out to me was early on in the interview where he was talking about, if you want to write for comics, it might be best to kind of draw out the pages, so you understand the flow of the panels, how much text you can get in if you need to. Even if you're not a great artist, it just helps you understand the medium a little bit better. And so I thought that was interesting. And of course, going from sci-fi to vigilantes like the Punisher and everything in between. Just a great, resume for Mr. Mike Baron. And go check out, again, Bronze Star, which is crowdfunding right now. So that will do it for today's episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. Thank you for listening. Thank you for viewing. Thank you for rating 5 stars, reviewing, subscribing, wherever you heard this, wherever you saw it. And we'll see you next time, Banditos. Peace.